everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Have you ever found yourself behind the wheel late at night, the darkness enveloping you as you navigate the desolate roads? The isolation allows for intrusive thoughts to present themselves. What a nightmare it would be if something ran into the road right now. Or thinking this would be the worst place to break down. Luckily, for the most part, these intrusions are nothing more than thoughts. Of course, there's always exceptions. Moments where the otherworldly really does seem to be concealing itself just beyond your headlights. The road can be a mysterious pathway. The veil between the unexplained and the real world can appear thin. So what happens when the unexplainable occurs? When what we experience contradicts what we know to be real life? Was that a fleeting glimpse of an extraterrestrial visitor? Or were you merely caught in a dreamlike state? So many stories yielding many more unanswered questions. Stories that will have you questioning the very fabric of reality. So, let's get started, shall we? I'm sure everyone says this, but I want to preface my story by saying that I try to be as rational and as logical as I can be in everything that I do. I wouldn't attribute something to the paranormal if I thought there would be a rational explanation. That being said, I've always had a fascination with the paranormal. Here are some of my, what I believe to be, paranormal experiences. The first was when I was about 10 years old. My family and I went to stay with my dad's sister and her family for Easter. Before my aunt and uncle split up, they lived in a very large, very old, almost mansion-like house. I loved this house, even though it often made me feel uneasy. One night when my extended family were in the kitchen playing board games, I opted to stay in the living room and watch TV. My family are all quite a bit older than me, and I often got bored sitting around with all the adults. I was channel hopping and generally zoning out when a noise startled me. The handle to the living room door was rattling. I quickly turned and the rattling stopped. I went to the door and opened it, expecting to see one of my brothers tearing down the corridor to the kitchen, but there was nobody there. The corridor was dark, lit only by the light that leaked out from around the kitchen door. I returned to the couch, a little perturbed but otherwise okay. A few minutes later, the rattling started again, this time more urgently. I quickly got up and sprinted to the door. For a moment, the rattling stopped. Then, to my horror, the handle began to turn, slowly but surely. I don't know how I found the courage to do so, but I ripped open the door while the handle was still turning, ready to scream at whoever was teasing me. The corridor was empty. I've considered several explanations, from the wind to a mini earthquake, but nothing explains how the handle started turning, as if someone was on the other side. My next experience, it took place in my family's home. I was about 15 and going through a phase of staying up late every night. Before my dad died, he ran several brass bands in the local area and often came home late at night. He'd always wind down with some TV before going to bed, but he'd always forget to put the headphones in. This night was no different. I was sitting reading on my bed, and I started to hear the muffled sound of the TV beneath my feet. I don't know if I was in a bad mood or something, but it made me really mad that night. I threw my book down, stormed down the stairs, flung open the living room door, and pitch black. The room was pitch black and dead silent. My heart started pounding. Had I imagined it? But I hadn't. As I shut the door and started to walk back up the stairs, the sound started up again. It sounded like a conversation, but no matter how hard I strained to hear what was being said, the voices remained distorted. I didn't sleep a wink that night. This last experience, it also occurred in my house. I was about 17 and settling in for bed at about 3 a.m. I was lying in bed, about to sleep, when I realized I needed to go to the bathroom. Absolute pain, but I dragged myself up nonetheless. As I go to open my door, I'm hit by a sudden sense of dread. Something's telling me not to go out into the landing. As I try to steady my breathing, I hear something outside my door. A slow, steady step going up the stairs. The stairs in my house are ridiculously creaky, and it's impossible to go up them without making a sound. I was also the only one in the house that night, so to hear the footsteps coming up the stairs was utterly terrifying. I shouted to whatever was outside, hoping to scare it off. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and it took me several minutes to muster up the courage to open the door. The landing was empty. I quickly went from room to room, looking for any evidence of someone having been in the house, but everything was undisturbed, and the windows were all shut. I didn't sleep a wink that night either. So, there you have it. Some very spooky, unexplained incidents that may or may not be paranormal. Senior year, 2011, my dad and I are driving home one late night after one of my volleyball tournaments. We live in Elma, Washington, which, if you don't know, it's rural as hell. With rural comes a lot of long roads, usually leading to nothing but houses and farmland. Our house is down one of those long roads. We've driven it 1,000 times, I'd have to guess. I even learned to drive on this road. It's not incredibly wide, that's for sure, or well lit, though it's rarely populated. We're never driving that fast because we don't hate our community. Plus, that night it was raining, and that's another reason to drive slower. Anyway, it was dark, raining. We'd been driving for over 2 hours, and I'd been dozing in and out most of that time. But now that we were on our road, I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. My dad was driving slowly, but I couldn't wait to be home, and I was already gathering my stuff, looking for my phone. My dad telling me to just wait a second when we have some light. I don't listen, turn on the cab light briefly. I go to unbuckle my seatbelt, and he asks me sternly if I'm serious, and tells me, don't even think about unbuckling that. This time I listened. I found my phone, so I turned off the light. As I switch the light off, I'm looking forward out the window. My dad and I both gasp at the exact same time. There's a man standing in the middle of the road. He only becomes visible just before there's no time to stop. Suddenly, my dad is swerving hard to the left, going clear into the other lane. He tried to overcorrect, and the combination of the rain and last-minute maneuvering, we didn't make a full 360, landed ourselves in the ditch. My dad checks to see if I'm okay, and thankfully, I'm fine. Once he confirms this, he immediately leaves the car and runs to the road. I grab my phone and follow him up the embankment. Just as my dad is about to reach the road, a blinding blue light flashes in front of us, lights up the whole area like it's daytime, just for a second, before darkness takes over again. My dad had sorta stumbled back, and I was there to help brace his fall. I asked him, even though I knew the answer, was that lightning? He keeps going up towards the road. We search for the man on the road, but it's like he'd vanished into thin air. There's no driveways close enough. We were on the only side of the road that someone could be walking on. The surrounding area, it's nothing but scattered trees and open land. No man anywhere. My dad holds his phone over the road, where we'd seen the man. He tells me to look at it. When I do, I can see there's a blackened piece of the road, like someone had burned it, similar to when you light off a firework. It didn't seem incredibly significant, but my dad was sure hyper-focused on it. Then suddenly his phone rings, and it breaks his concentration after giving both of us the jump scare of our lives. Already too many for one night. It's my mom. So my dad quickly explains he needs her to come pull us out of the ditch with the other rig. While waiting for her, my dad says to me, "You know that wasn't lightning, right?" I had a feeling, I told him, especially when no thunder rolled in. I asked what he thought it was. He just told me he didn't really know, but that the mark on the road, the guy, and the light, they all seemed to appear in the exact same spot. Once my mom showed up, we used the headlights of the truck to scan the area, see if we'd missed anything in the vicinity, but there was nothing or no one out there with us. My parents were talking about it when we got home. My dad was still fired up about the whole thing, kept wondering if he should go out there and look for the guy or what. My mom convinced him to stay inside, saying that she's going to report what we saw to the police and let them check it out. When she asks us what he was wearing, what we saw, we both just sort of look at each other. What had they been wearing? I told my dad I couldn't be sure, but it looked like maybe he was wearing all one color. He sort of shook his head, no, but agreed verbally that, yeah, maybe all one color, like gray or some sort of blue. We couldn't seem to agree on the color. In fact, the more we thought about it, the less we could recall. Also, now sitting in the light of the dining room, it's obvious that my dad has some sort of markings or burns on his forearms and face. They look like sunburns, but in a line going horizontally across his upper body. We decided that the only thing that could have caused this was the bright light that flashed for a moment as we made our way up the embankment. My mom starts checking me over, looking for marks. Nothing, but she ordered both of us to take showers. This is probably a good time to mention that my mom is big on X-Files. She loves her aliens and fantasy shows. My dad too, but sci-fi, if you will, it's her favorite. She starts talking about how she saw that flash of light, chalked it up to lightning, till there was no thunder. She says that she knew my dad was about to call her, and that's why she called my dad. She also points out how it's odd that neither of us hit our heads, but we seem to be having memory problems from the last hour. We couldn't deny that what she was saying wasn't entirely insane. It was actually odd how we couldn't really recall any details of the figure in the road, and that we'd even started calling it the figure instead of the man. But I felt like I'd retained enough to grasp onto the fact that who or what we saw was a man. He was at least in the shape of one when we almost collided with him in our car. The whole thing, it still just leaves this unsettling oddity feeling. Like my dad and I try to laugh it off sometimes, yet it always leads back to this place where I know we're both just sitting there, thinking about it, wondering, speculating. Just something we'll never really have an answer for, I suppose. I was swimming in the ocean with a friend when I saw something floating in the water nearby us. I knew what it looked like to me, but it was a bit transparent. I asked my friend if he saw anything floating a few feet away from us and pointed to where I was seeing it. He said he didn't see anything. Then he asked me what I saw. I told him I could see what looked like a woman's body, floating face down, naked, with long red hair. He was understandably freaked out and wanted to get out of the water immediately. We went inside, changed, and started preparing dinner. His roommate came home, and while we were all sitting around talking, I started asking his roommate some questions about his job as a criminal defense attorney. As the conversation went on, I asked him if he ever had to defend anyone he knew on serious charges. He said yes, actually, after a friend of his was charged with murder when his wife's body washed ashore, right in front of this very condo 12 years ago. I looked over at my friend, and he was 50 shades of pale, with his jaw on the floor. Then I asked his roommate to describe what she looked like. He said that she had very long red hair, and that she was found naked, lying face down on the beach. I let my friend explain what had happened earlier that day. They were both stunned. When my dad died in 1979, it was sudden and without warning. He was entering his bedroom to lay down and take a nap. My aunt and I heard the thud when he hit the small rocking chair and then the floor. I looked at him and knew that he was dead before he hit the floor. His routine each morning, starting at 5 o'clock, he got out of bed, got dressed, then walked through the living room, through the small swinging doors into the kitchen. He would go over to the chair between the small table and kitchen counter, plug in his coffee pot, sit down, and wait for the first cup to brew. When he pulled the chair out, it always made a slight scraping sound. After the funeral, I stayed on for a while in the back bedroom, just down a short hallway. The first time it happened, I wasn't sure how to react, nor if it had really happened. 5 o'clock in the morning, I came awake with the realization that someone was in the house. I crept out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and tried to silently head toward the living room. The telephone was there, and I could call the police. When I got there, no one was there. I searched the house over. No one. I went back to bed thinking it must have been a dream. I was also coming down with influenza and figured that I had hallucinated. 3 nights later, 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm awake listening to footsteps. I had just gotten out of bed when I heard the swinging doors of the kitchen. I managed to sneak down the short hallway, flipped on the light, and nothing. Okay, and this went on for the rest of the week, until finally I just lay in bed, listening to the sounds, and then it took a horrific turn. I heard the chair at the table scrape out, and then the smell of coffee brewing filled the air. I could even hear the coffee pot brewing. I just lay there in bed, not knowing what to think, trying to not start screaming. Why, I'll never know. And after a few minutes, there was silence and no coffee smell. This went on for 3 nights. I called a friend of mine to come over and spend the night. I told him that I was trying to just recover from my dad's death and needed someone around. He agreed. He woke me up the next morning a few minutes after 5. "Billy," he whispered. "There's someone in the house." I calmed him down and told him to just sit on the bed and wait. And sure enough, we heard footsteps into the kitchen, the scrape of the chair, and the strong smell of brewing coffee. He quietly followed me in the dark to the kitchen. I turned on the light, and nothing. The coffee pot was not on. The chair hadn't been moved. The next move was quick and decisive. Robert was dressing, heading out of the bedroom door entrance to the outside, and he says, "I don't know what's going on here, and I don't give a fuck. I'm out of here." After 2 more days of the visits, I walked into the kitchen, stood in the middle of the floor, and shouted, "Dad, you can't keep doing this. You're dead. You died. Please, I love you and I miss you, but please go away. Go wherever you're supposed to go. I can't keep going through this with you." And then I broke down and cried like a baby. The visit stopped at that moment. No more. I've often wondered if sometimes when we die, if it's monstrously sudden, do we realize that we're dead? Do we try to continue on as if nothing out of the way has happened? Do we have to be told that we're dead and that we need to move on? I don't know the answer to these questions, but I do know what I experienced, and I know that Robert would never set foot in the house again, and he would never talk about that morning. My ex-father-in-law was a troop leader for a local Boy Scouts. I was chaperoning a group of boys on a night hike in some woodland locally. I remained at the base in the car park helping prepare tea, cocoa, and snacks. A few of the kids were always around as they went out in intervals with one leader or another, so it was important for an adult to be there to supervise them. I was around 18, 19 at the time. A car pulled into the car park, which had been corded off and reserved for us to use for the day so the kids would be safe. No one got out of the car, so another leader went over to tell them that the park was off limits or to see if it was a parent showing up early for some reason. They came back almost immediately and told me to call the police. I was the only one with a phone at the time. They said the man in the car wouldn't speak, but was wearing a mask. It was actually the mask from the Scream films, and that he had a shotgun, a pile of rope, and tarpaulin in his car. I remember being so scared that I couldn't even remember the name of the park when I was speaking to the police. I was shaking and couldn't get the words out quickly enough. All I could think was that we couldn't see the car, so I had no idea if the man was still in it or out in the woods, where we had 30 kids in the dark, with no way of contacting them. Thankfully, the police showed up in minutes, quickly found the man, and arrested him. He said that he was out there hunting rabbits. Why would you do so with a shotgun, or need a mask and rope? I don't know. We got all the kids back safely and didn't tell them what had happened, but the sight of 7 or 8 police cars and a police dog, it was pretty difficult to ignore. Definitely one of the scariest experiences I've had. There's a house a few doors down that's been sitting vacant for years. Now its decay has become an eyesore on our street and probably brings the house value of our own neighborhood down. It's one of the first things you see when you pull into our cul-de-sac. The house is in shambles from years of neglect. The yard's overgrown with tall grass and weeds. A large part of a tree had fallen through the roof long ago, and the house was never fixed. My dad used to golf with the man that lived there. Then one day, cop cars filled up our little dead-end road. All of us stood pressed against the window to watch my dad's golf buddy get let out in handcuffs. We'd later find out that he murdered his wife a few months prior. My dad had hung out with this man multiple times during those months. His name was Eric. I remember my dad was genuinely shook to the core about this. My dad said that when Eric's wife would get brought into the conversation, he talked proudly about all the plans he and his wife Rachel were attending to the following days. All the while, her body was stuffed into the hollow of an oak tree that touched their bedroom terrace. Same oak tree that set a branch through the ceiling years later. The HOA board that Rachel used to be a part of helped organize the funeral with the family, and everyone in the neighborhood showed up to pay their respects. The murder felt so out of nowhere. There had to be more to the story. but nobody had a bad word to say about Eric. It caught the whole community off guard. He was a 5-star dentist and a member of the church. Eric and Rachel were both held with high regard in the community. Now, everything had changed. The next HOA meeting would happen on a Sunday afternoon the following month. My dad would talk to a man named David. He'd been a mutual friend with Eric. David and Eric were close friends and worked at the church together. Out of everyone, David took the news the hardest. He was in denial that his friend could commit such atrocities. David would actually visit Eric in prison, if only to get some closure. All David wanted was for his friend to say he didn't do it. He was looking for any sign of hope that his friend wasn't the monster everyone thought he was. But I don't think the story David told my dad gave anyone any sort of peace of mind. David said that when he went into the visitation area, he was on a phone behind glass. The guards led Eric into the room. He'd lost a lot of weight, and the dark rings around his eyes, they led David to believe he wasn't doing too well in his new conditions. When Eric saw David, however, he smiled a big, joyful smile, almost a creepy smile, at David. Given the circumstances, he thought Eric would be acting as somber and exhausted as he looked. But when David picked up his end of the phone, his voice was chipper. Eric told David that he was hopeful about his release. In the same positive tone, Eric fully admits to murdering his wife. David asks, why? Eric explains that his actions were forced upon him by a higher power. Since Eric's childhood, he said that angels in blue light would visit him, describing them as 3 tall, magnificent beings in white robes. They had large black eyes that he could see his reflection in when they got close. These beings visited Eric multiple times throughout his adolescence. He'd be woken up by a large orb of blue light that would float into his room, divide itself into 3 separate orbs. Then those orbs would stretch into angels in his room. This even happened once when Eric had a friend stay the night in his room. No matter what Eric did, he couldn't wake him up until they were gone, and the blue glow had finally extinguished from the room. On his later encounter, they implanted a triangular chip into the back of his neck. David would confirm that Eric did have a triangular scar, about the size of a dime on the back of his neck. Eric had shaved his head while incarcerated, and the nape of his neck was no longer hidden by hair. The skin, according to David, it looked raised, like a new tattoo, but with no ink. Could he have done this right before seeing David? No, because David's visit was a surprise to Eric, and he didn't say any of this in his defense. He pleaded guilty. The angels had made a pact with Eric, never to speak of their interactions until he fulfilled his duty to God. During most of these angel visits, they'd enter his room. Their warm light would fill him with a euphoric calm. They'd float to his bed, scan the chip, then leave. But sometimes, these angels would tell Eric that he needed to prove himself to God in order to earn his place with them in the blue light. This test by God was ordered at 4 different times of Eric's life. Sacrifice what you love most to demonstrate your loyalty. When he was 5, he could barely understand what they meant, but to the best of his knowledge, under the presence of their influence, he grabbed his favorite book from the shelf next to his bed, The Tiger Who Came to Tea. His mom would read it to him every night until he'd fall asleep. I remembered that name because I had the same exact book in my bedroom when I heard this story. The angels gave Eric a sign of approval and left after he'd torn the pages of the book and thrown them around his room. The next morning, he watched his mother cry. He couldn't tell her why he'd done it, so he said, I don't know. He thought their relationship changed a little bit after that. The second was his hamster. The third was his grandmother. In his teenage years, his mother had passed away, and he was finally old enough to escape his father's alcoholism and abuse. His grandmother helped him graduate and apply for all the scholarships to get into college. The night before he left, they showed up. Eric then casually admits to David another murder he committed for these angels. He explains how he smothered her with a pillow, then made it look like she had died in her sleep before he left for college. His final test, number 4, was Rachel. Eric felt no guilt, no shame, or understanding of what he'd done. At the end of their conversation, he even tells David that the angels in blue will soon retrieve him from these walls. David hangs up the phone, and he can't help but cry because he knew that was the last time he was going to hear Eric's voice on the phone. Eric stands up with a grin, but as he's being led away, he notices David's tears, and he gives him a confused look, like he doesn't understand why David would be upset. But he's quickly turned and pushed out by a guard. Out of respect for the family and to deter any vandals thinking of destroying that house, visiting the neighborhood, etc., names have been changed. But this story and that house are 100% real existing lore we have in our neighborhood. A story we'd all much rather forget than embrace, but happened nonetheless. The housing market right now is tough as it is. I'm sure as hell not going to be able to sell this property if people know what happened a few doors down. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me, whether it's your first time or you're a regular. Your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open long enough for those deep sleep videos. And of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour @gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.